Thanks for listening. I'm Jacob Kauffman with KUAR News. I'm speaking with the two candidates in June 10th's runoff election for the Republican Party's Attorney General nomination. Leslie Rutledge lives in Little Rock and has worked at the Republican National Committee in the Arkansas Division of Children and Family Services and as a deputy prosecutor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me on today.
David Sterling also lives in Little Rock and practices commercial business and contract law at Cox, Sterling, and McClure. Thanks for being here, David.
Thank you for having me.
Many of your positions are well known, but we have a chance now for you both to further distinguish yourselves and bring up some issues that maybe didn't get so much attention before the May 20th primary. But first, can you just tell us why you decided to run? Mr. Sterling.
Well, I decided to run because I think that there's a lot of really important issues that are facing Arkansans today, and I really do think that the greatest challenge facing all Arkansans is an overreaching federal government that is just creeping in on state authority and individual liberty in violation of the 10th Amendment. And so I was looking around trying to figure out who was going to be running for Attorney General this year. No one was stepping up, and I see it as a critically important office in the state of Arkansas. And so after a lot of thought and prayer, praying with my wife and daughter for a couple months, decided to throw my hat in the ring and offer myself up to public service. I've been practicing law now for 15 years. I have the highest peer review rating. Other lawyers and judges have given me an AV rating, which is the highest rating you can have for a lawyer in practice, and decided to give all that up and just offer myself up to public service to try to do good for the state of Arkansas and to fight for all Arkansans.
Mrs. Rutledge?
Sure, I've spent the last 13 years practicing law, whether it was working as a prosecutor, as you mentioned, being counsel to Governor Mike Huckabee, counsel at the Republican National Committee, and all of the jobs that I've had have been, in the realm of looking out for Arkansans, working for conservative causes. And so when I decided to run for Attorney General, it was after a long time of people coming to me and asking me, based on my experience, would I consider running? And I did, because Arkansas needs a strong Attorney General, one with experience fighting this overreaching federal government of Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. I've sat at the table, some of the country's top conservative lawyers, developing legal strategy to combat this overreaching federal government. I have had experience in the courtroom, prosecuting criminals, working with local law enforcement, and that's a big role of the Attorney General. So I'm glad that we're here today to talk about some issues that perhaps haven't had as much, exposure, if you will, in the role of the Attorney General, and that's why I'm running, is because Arkansas needs a conservative Republican Attorney General at the helm, fighting back against this overreaching federal government and keeping criminals in the pen where they belong.
Medical marijuana. Both of you have been outspoken about what you perceive as the overreach of the federal government, but this issue sees the most action at the state level, nationwide. If Arkansas voters decide to legalize marijuana in November, what would your response be? Mrs. Rutledge, I know Colorado's Attorney General contributed to your campaign. What would you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, I am against legalization of marijuana, and that's based on my experience as a prosecutor. I do believe that it is a gateway drug, and I've seen how lives are affected, and not just as a prosecutor, but also working in the Department of Human Services and going to court with foster kids. We have a lot of children who not only have their families failed them, but the state is failing them. And if the medical marijuana passes, I will enforce and defend the law of the state just as any law, and not put my own personal preferences. I'm not going to be like Eric Holder and pick and choose which laws to enforce and not. And I think that's where my opponent and I differ, is because he refuses to take a stand against marijuana. And I think that conservatives have, strongly stated that, they are not in support of this.
Well, thankfully we have your opponent, Mr. Sterling, right here.
Yeah, well, that's actually a misstatement of my position on medical marijuana. My position on it is I am also opposed to it personally, but as Attorney General, it's not going to be my job to pick and choose which laws to defend and which laws to ignore. Ms. Rutledge has taken that position on the death penalty and the use of the electric chair. She refuses to take a stand on the electric chair. She's opposed to it. And so she is being like Eric Holder and picking and choosing which laws to enforce and which ones to ignore. My own personal preference is, if this is on the ballot in November, personally I will be voting against medical marijuana. However, if voters do pass that law, I will enforce that law. I will defend that law. And if voters reject it, then I will defend current Arkansas law, drug laws, and prosecute criminals based on that, to the extent that the AG's office is involved in that.
But for both of you, to make sure I understand this correctly, in that particular issue, you do think that state law supersedes federal laws?
Well, I think they complement each other. I mean, state law and federal law. There are state laws on the issue, and there are federal laws on the issue. And to the extent that state law changes on it, I will defend state law. If our voters in November decide that they want to legalize the use of medical marijuana, then I will defend that, even against federal laws that prohibit it.
Leslie?
And just to be clear on the record, that the Family Council survey, my opponent, refused to answer and said that he didn't have an opinion on. So he has gone on record with having no opinion. He stated publicly on his Facebook page a number of times that he has no opinion on legalizing marijuana, and therefore that's why I think it's important. And when we talk about, when you're the candidate, people are always calling. When we talk about ethical standards, then and what we would do as Attorney General. Just last week in the Arkansas News, and you were there for the news conference, and just like last week, my opponent outright lied about my experience and said that I only had 2 years of law practice experience.
Right, but if we could just limit it to the subject of medical marijuana, if the state law passed, you would respect the voters' will?
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Both of you declared your support for upholding the state's ban on marriage for same-sex couples. If this issue is ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in the near future, would you accept that ruling? David?
If the U.S. Supreme Court rules on that, yeah, I mean, I don't think you have a choice but to follow the U.S. Supreme Court precedent. Justice Kennedy in the Windsor case said, when that case came down last year, that domestic relations, including same-sex marriage, is a matter that has traditionally been within the purview of the state authority under the Constitution, under the 10th Amendment. And I hope that he holds true to that whenever this issue comes up before the United States Supreme Court. We've got a ruling here in the state of Arkansas where Judge Chris Piazza has declared that the same-sex marriage ban, Amendment 83 to our Arkansas Constitution, that was approved by a 75% majority in 2004, was unconstitutional not only under the United States Supreme Court, under the United States Constitution, but also the Arkansas Constitution. And those are two separate issues. The Arkansas Supreme Court is going to be the ultimate authority over whether or not it's constitutional under the Arkansas Constitution. I'm hoping that they find that it is constitutional under the Arkansas Constitution because, by very definition, it's a constitutional amendment. So it's been grafted into the Arkansas Constitution, defining marriages between one man and one woman. So I don't understand how Judge Piazza can find that a constitutional amendment is unconstitutional under the Arkansas Constitution. If the Arkansas Supreme Court upholds that and overturns him and upholds the constitutionality of Amendment 83, then because he also ruled that it was unconstitutional under the federal Constitution, that will ultimately go to the United States Supreme Court. And I look forward to taking the reins of that litigation and taking that appeal all the way directly to the United States Supreme Court if necessary, and will defend it vehemently because I think it is. I think we ought to hold Justice Kennedy to his words in saying that these domestic relations issues are within the purview of the states, not within the federal government. But if he rules that it is unconstitutional under the federal Constitution, we won't have a choice but to accept that, unfortunately.
Mrs. Rutledge?
As Attorney General, we'll look at all of these, and certainly the Supreme Court of the United States is the law of the land. But just as in, I am pro-life, and currently right now, the Supreme Court has stated that, to allow abortions. We need a strong Attorney General that will continue fighting while respecting the law and upholding and defending the law of Arkansas. But, the same with traditional marriage. I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, and I will take that appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court, and certainly would be on the, the 14th Amendment part of the aspect. And I've worked with the Arkansas, a number of members of the Arkansas Supreme Court because they were on the Court of Appeals at the time that I was a law clerk, and I was a lawyer at the time that I was a law clerk. And these folks aren't going to take this, they're not going to just throw an opinion in the next week or two. They're going to take time and research, and I believe, and I strongly believe, and will advocate for them upholding the wishes of 75% of the citizens of Arkansas, which define marriage as between one man and one woman.
Begin with you, Mrs. Rutledge. Would that biblical basis for the argument that homosexuality is a sin mean you'd support past efforts that banned same-sex couples from adopting or fostering children?
Are you asking would I support?
Did you support it in the past, and if a similar piece of law came forward again, would you support it?
Well, I mean, we will certainly see when that comes forward. We, having had experience working with foster children, as I mentioned, that these children need someone to love them. And so I am a strong advocate for them having strong families. I do believe that, you know, having a mother and a father is always the best scenario, as I think many of us do. I was raised by two great people. Both my parents are very loving, you know, made sure that we had a great family life, and I believe that my mother has the patience of Job. She's an elementary special education teacher, retired. And those sort of values that they instilled in me in that sort of home environment is optimal. However, not every child has that. We have many single parent families, and we need an environment to allow for that. And so, you know, if it comes up, then we will look at it. And my role as Attorney General will not be to advocate one way or the other, but will be to make sure it would be constitutionally upheld and to work with the legislators.
Mr. Sterling?
Well, I think that this same issue has already come up as far as, I mean, I think there's Judge Piazza that ruled on this as well, and it went all the way to the Arkansas Supreme Court, and the Arkansas Supreme Court basically said it was unconstitutional to make that distinction. So, you know, as Attorney General, again, I'm not going to be like Eric Holder and try to ignore the law that is on the books. I will fight and defend Arkansas law, and if the Arkansas Supreme Court has ruled on it, which it has, I'll just defend Arkansas law.
All right, and whether it be same-sex marriage or voter ID, or whether or not same-sex couples could adopt or foster children, it seems with all of these laws and the abortion bills as well, the Attorney General in the past few years has served to tell the legislators that this will be found unconstitutional almost undoubtedly and will cost the state a large degree of money. Mrs. Rutledge, would you give the legislature the same advice, or would you urge them to pursue those laws?
Well, I don't know that I would give the same advice as Dustin McDaniel or Mike Beebe or Mark Pryor or Winston Bryan on down the line. So we've never elected a Republican Attorney General. It depends on what the language of the statutes that come before us. I can't sit here and state that I'm going to say something's not going to be upheld constitutionally because I haven't seen it. And that's when we're going to exercise reasonableness and be responsible and not show up like a magic show in these legislative hearings, which is what has been done in the past, the Attorney General's office. And I know that because I was counsel to Governor Mike Huckabee, and I saw firsthand the impact that the Attorney General's opinion can have in committee meetings on our legislators. So my goal would be to work with them to make sure that it would be upheld, you know, if challenged in the courts.
Mr. Sterling?
Well, you know, I've been practicing law, doing business and commercial litigation now in the state of Arkansas, advising Arkansans and Arkansas businesses on matters of Arkansas law for 15 years now, and am highly respected for my legal ability and ethical standards. And as such, you know, in that role as an attorney, as counsel to these Arkansas businesses and Arkansans, you know, you advise them on the pros and cons of any litigation that you might take on, or any situation that they're seeking your advice on. I've always given very seasoned advice to these folks, and will do the same thing for the Arkansas legislature. If they ask me for my opinion as to the constitutionality of a law or statute that they're looking at implementing, I will try to give them a fair and balanced opinion on the constitutionality of it and what the odds are, or what the likelihood is that it's going to be challenged, and what the hurdles that will be faced if they pursue that line of law or statute.
An interview with Roby Brock from Talk Business and Politics broached the subject of capital punishment and the possibility of utilizing the electric chair if the state's unable to secure drugs used in lethal injection amidst a national scarcity. Tennessee just enacted a law permitting its use. Mr. Sterling, you've said you would pursue the electric chair option. Is that your limit, or would you pursue firing squads and gas chambers as well?
Well, what I've actually said on the record, I even issued a press release on this in January of this year, is I have offered a solution to the lethal injection statute that we have here in the state of Arkansas, moving from what we've traditionally used, which is sodium thiopental, which the European manufacturers dried up export of that drug to the U.S. because it's used in capital punishment. Some states like Ohio and Texas, Oklahoma and Tennessee have moved to using a new drug called pentobarbital, and Ohio and Texas and Oklahoma have had trouble getting that because the European manufacturer of that has threatened to dry up export to the U.S. on that too. So what they've done is they've moved to using, contracting with local compounding pharmacies, domestic compounding pharmacies, and getting the drugs that way. Anti-death penalty advocates have used the FOI laws to find the identities of those manufacturers and have started protesting outside those facilities trying to shut them down. So what I've said and what I've proposed to do is to change our drug cocktail to using pentobarbital #1 and then excluding the identity of the domestic manufacturers from the FOI law. That way it would, I guess, give us a ready supply without the manufacturers being threatened to shut down. Currently, Arkansas law requires us to use the electric chair. When our legislature enacted lethal injection as our preferred method of execution in the early 80s, in their wisdom they said if this lethal injection statute is ever declared unconstitutional, we shall use electrocution. And so what I've said is that as Attorney General, I'm not going to be an Eric Holder picking and choosing which laws I'm going to enforce and which ones I'm going to ignore, like Ms. Rutledge has taken a stance in this position. But current Arkansas law says that we shall be using electrocution. And all I've said is as Attorney General, I'll enforce the law as it's on the books, as our legislature has preferred.
And why don't you think the public has a right to know the types of drugs manufactured, or at least the place where they're being made?
Well, I think that it's a matter of having ready access to the drugs in order to take care of, trying to get this death penalty statute back on track. You know, Dustin McDaniel said last summer that our death penalty system is broken, and the reason it's broken is because anti-death penalty advocates have sought to use the legal system to make executions as expensive as possible. And they put the AG's offices in all 50 states, or any state that has the death penalty in place, put them through all kinds of legal hurdles and try to drive up the expense of execution. And so to the extent that they're abusing the FOI laws in order to try to subvert the rule of law, which is execution, I mean, we've got 33 people on death row right now. We've got 33 families that are suffering. You know, we got 33 innocent victims that were brutally murdered, and now we've got 33 people waiting on death row while lawyers and politicians struggle with trying to figure out which drug is best to use to humanely execute these people. One guy that's on death row is on death row because he raped and murdered a 5-year-old girl and stuffed her dead carcass into a hollowed out tree. And here we are trying to figure out if we should, I mean, Ms. Rutledge wants to work with the FDA apparently and try to figure out how to get her hands on some drugs. I've already offered a way to actually get the drugs necessary to execute criminals like this.
Are you arguing
and
then?
I can jump in at some point.
Sure, just after this one question, are you arguing then that if the public knows something and it causes them to protest, and the result of their protest is that a program is stopped, that's justification for exempting FOI laws?
No, I'm saying that there are some limited circumstances where the FOI laws don't apply. I mean, there are exemptions as far as the governor's working papers. There's exemptions as far as the working papers of the Attorney General's office. There's many exemptions to the FOI laws, and all I'm talking about here is trying to get our death penalty statute back up and running, trying to get these 33 families, give them some closure as we try to honor the victims of these heinous crimes, and stop looking out necessarily for the people that have already been tried by a jury of 12, have been found by unanimous verdict that they were guilty of these crimes. They were sentenced separately to death under our capital punishment statute, and I think we need to get that up and moving again.
Mrs. Rutledge?
Sure. First and foremost, I am in support of the death penalty, just so we're clear, but I support a responsible and reasonable approach to it. The suggestion that we can use the electric chair, which is currently in the Old State House Museum, it's in the archives of the museum. And so we can't just pull old Sparky out, plug it in, and start using it. It would take literally years of litigation in order to do so. And so that is irresponsible rhetoric. And quite frankly, I feel that, because of Mr. Sterling's lack of experience and absolute no experience in criminal law is why he's preying on the emotions of the families of these victims that have suffered through enough in order to get votes in this election. And if you don't understand criminal law and have no experience in criminal law, then you would suggest something such as this. That is just reckless and irresponsible. So that's why my proposal has been to, let's work to obtain the drugs necessary so that way we can see these executions out. It's not to prey on people's emotions and these families that have been through so much. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm interested in seeing the law out. And also, it's a governor's decision. It's not an attorney general's decision as to whether or not we have an execution or whether or not the means by which we carry out that execution. So that's either going to be Governor Asa Hutchinson or Governor Mike Ross. It's not going to be the attorney general's decision. And again, I think that goes to a lack of understanding of the role of the attorney general, that Mr. Sterling has above and beyond gone out of his way to bring up issues such as the electric chair, because it's just not a decision the attorney general is going to make, and it's preying on the emotions of families that have gone through enough already.
All right, this will go to you, Mrs.
Sure.
Rutledge. You've both mentioned your desire to limit the authority of the federal government. The real question is what that manifestation might look like in Arkansas. The EPA is proposing a set of rules to limit carbon emissions at existing power plants. This law would apply to some coal power plants in Arkansas, requiring them to improve emission levels. Would you want that law to be enforced, Mrs. Rutledge?
Well, I would want to look at the law and see a little more in depth about it before I weighed in on it. I'm not going to just shoot from the hip. I do believe that the EPA has what I would say, and I speak in very plain language. I'm not going to give you a pile of legalese just to sound like a smart lawyer, because I've had 13 years of practicing law experience. I don't need to use much 50-cent words for your listeners. That the EPA has at times gotten in what I would call cahoots with far left-wing organizations, and then they do what they call a sue and settle. So the organization will sue the EPA, and then the EPA will implement regulations. And I don't know if this is perhaps one of those examples where the EPA has done that, but our Attorney General sat on the sidelines. And we need an Attorney General that recognizes what's going on and that aggressively goes after those instances and joins in lawsuits or outright sues the EPA on the Freedom of Information request, and see, when they've allowed fee waivers, for example. And again, it goes back to experience. I'm the only one with experience fighting this overreaching federal government. When my opponent talks about having a federalism task force, a number of things go off in my head. One, we're going to grow government because we're going to have a task force or committee to do the job that he, quite frankly, just doesn't have the experience doing. And so you have to hire other people to do something when you don't have experience doing it yourself. I believe there's 173 employees, give or take, at the Attorney General's office. As Attorney General, I'll be able to task any number of those employees and say, we want to look at this issue, and this issue. And so as Attorney General, the buck's going to stop with Leslie Rutledge. It's not going to push it off onto a task force or a committee and grow government.
Mr. Sterling.
Well, I think that's just kind of interesting that she says that she talks about her experience. And first of all, Ms. Rutledge does only have 2 years law practice experience. She practiced for 1 year, 8 years ago with the Lonoke County Prosecutor's Office as a deputy prosecuting attorney. She practiced for 1 year with the Department of Human Services here in the state 7 years ago. Other than that, she's been a law clerk or a political operative for the rest of her legal career. So to sit here and say that she has the experience to sue the EPA makes no sense. She has no civil litigation experience whatsoever. I've got 15 years of civil litigation experience. I understand these issues. When it comes to the EPA and some of the things that they're doing, whether it's carbon emissions or some of these other issues, we've seen the EPA get involved in Arkansas politics, Arkansas business in recent years, such as, with the phosphorus levels in the Illinois River up in northwest Arkansas. The EPA came in and basically has caused the businesses up there, the poultry industry, to spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get the phosphorus levels down to an acceptable level to them, with no empirical data whatsoever to justify, why they need to get these levels down to where they're wanting them to do, where they're wanting them to go. The Attorney General in Oklahoma, Drew Edmondson, at the time, he's the one that sued Arkansas. Businesses sued the state of Arkansas, sued these businesses, trying to get them to spend this money to get these phosphorus levels down. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and they've gotten them down to an acceptable level. And now the current Attorney General in Oklahoma, Scott Pruitt, has seen that, the EPA, and he's a Republican Attorney General. He's someone that has a level head on his shoulders, and he's seen the lack of rational basis for trying to spend getting Arkansas businesses to spend hundreds of millions of more dollars trying to get the phosphorus levels down to a level that's acceptable to the EPA with no empirical data. So he's entered into a consent judgment or a consent decree right now with the state of Arkansas, and has given the EPA 3 years to come up with some kind of empirical data that shows why these businesses have to spend these hundreds of millions of dollars, And we will get the conclusions of that within the next year, year and a half, and then we'll see if it makes sense. I think what you're talking about here with the carbon emissions, I think a similar approach ought to be taken there. The EPA ought to have some rational basis for trying to get these emissions levels down to this point and causing Arkansas businesses, Arkansas taxpayers to spend this kind of money to get these emissions levels down to a point that's only acceptable to them, but with no empirical data or any rational basis for those levels.
I think they would argue that they have an enormous amount of empirical evidence and that they're a scientific organization run largely by technocrats, but that's a separate issue and I'm not the EPA. Any office holder needs to be wary of creating even an appearance of impropriety or favoritism. Mrs. Rutledge, in your 10-day pre-election primary filing of campaign funds raised, nearly 46% came from businesses, PACs, or out-of-state donors, including 11% from Washington, D.C. area. How would you assure voters you would not pick favorites in delegating attention, energy, or litigation?
Sure, and I'm going to address that, and I also want to address a gross misunderstanding and outright lie. So first we're going to talk about, because I've worked with folks across the country as a lawyer for Governor Mike Huckabee when he was running for president, as a lawyer for the Republican National Committee. So of course I had out-of-state donors and developed relationships over the years. The role of the Attorney General is to be a fair and impartial and to implement the law and to enforce and defend the law. And so I can assure you there's not going to be any cutting deals and cutting favorites. I've been known throughout my entire career and my entire life as being someone who's tough and fair and is going to work hard. And oftentimes in the roles that I've had to tell people, I've had to be the bearer of bad news and say, what we're doing is wrong and we need to fix it. And so I can assure you there will be no playing favorites except for on behalf of the citizens. And that's when I was a lawyer being a prosecutor. I was advocating for citizens when I was a lawyer for DHS. So now I'd like to take a moment to address Mr. Sterling's claim that I've only been practicing law for 2 years. And perhaps we need to educate not only Mr. Sterling, but maybe your viewers that the word counsel is synonymous with lawyer. And we'll get a thesaurus if we need to. I'll use a 50-cent word just for the benefit of having needing one. And so in my 13 years, I'm going to walk through my resume for you all. I did start out as a law clerk. In 2001, I'd passed the bar, so I was a lawyer and working for Court of Appeals judge. And then I spent time as counsel to Governor Mike Huckabee as a lawyer, advising the governor, advising legislators, advising state agencies on the law as a lawyer. And then I was a prosecutor in Roanoke County for over a year, handling criminal cases, working with local law enforcement, something that David Sterling has never done. He's never handled criminal cases. Then I was a lawyer for the Department of Human Services, going to court with foster children, working, with a judge, with, social workers as a lawyer. And then I was counsel again to Mike Huckabee when he ran for president. And again, counsel is synonymous with lawyer or attorney. Advising the governor, making sure that the governor was on the ballot in all 50 states. And then I was deputy counsel at the National Republican Congressional Committee under Tom Cole, the congressman from Oklahoma, who was the chairman of the Republican Congressional Committee, making sure that legally the campaign committee and the candidates adhered to the law in campaign finance, in defamation, anti-defamation. And then I was counsel to the Republican National Committee for 3 years, and now I have my own law practice. And as counsel to the Republican National Committee, I wasn't a political operative, I was a lawyer. We had over 200 employees. I handled all the employment issues. When people went and voted for Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan in 2012, or they saw them on the ballot, they were on the ballot because I worked with the secretaries of state of all 50 states to make sure. I sat next to Speaker John Boehner as he signed the documents that I created as a lawyer. So to insult me into my profession and my legal career and all the others that have held those positions, to say that that was not practicing law, is an outright lie. And I think that citizens of Arkansas would be astounded to know that someone running to be the chief legal officer would lie about their opponent's record as a lawyer.
Mr. Sterling?
Well, I'd like to respond to that. I've never said that she's not been licensed to practice law for only 2 years. What I've said is she's only got 2 years of actual legal practice experience. Again, she worked for 1 year, 8 years ago, as a deputy in the Roanoke County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. She worked for 1 year for the Department of Human Services 7 years ago here in the state of Arkansas. Other than that, it's been working as a law clerk and working as a political operative either for the Huckabee administration or working for the NRCC or the RNC. It's not meant to be an insult. It's just meant to educate voters on the fact that if they're going to hire a lawyer through their votes to be the Attorney General for the state of Arkansas, they ought to at least elect somebody that has actually had law practice experience. I've been practicing in business and commercial litigation in Arkansas, representing Arkansans and Arkansas business on matters of Arkansas law for 15 years now. And you know, it's not a matter of, I mean, I understand what the difference is between being a licensed lawyer and actually practicing law, and that's the distinction I'm trying.
Clearly you do not, David.
And that's the
Clearly
distinction.
you do not.
That's the distinction I'm trying to make. You know, Ms. Rutledge put out an e-blast last week that says she spent her entire career as a prosecutor, and that's untrue. I've got the email in my inbox right now. She's only spent 1 year as a deputy in the prosecuting attorney's office in Lonoke County. So, you know, when she wants to embellish a record like that in order to get votes, I think somebody ought to at least check up on what exactly is her practice. And she was talking about how I don't have any criminal law experience. All my experience has been in the private practice, in civil practice. But, you know, she's talking about suing the EPA. She's talking about doing all these things. Those are civil litigation matters. And Ms. Rutledge has no civil litigation experience whatsoever.
I actually do, as counsel at the Republican National Committee, as counsel at the National Republican Congressional Committee. Part of that role was to develop legal strategy, to write briefs, to file
Your listeners
briefs.
can do a PACER search for any pleading that's ever been signed by Ms. Rutledge, and they will find
Well,
out.
Mr. Sterling, I'm sure the listeners have got a lot to think about from both of you today, and I'm sure they'll delve into it more if they're interested in it. Mr. Sterling, I'd like to ask you the same question about your campaign finance reports that I asked Mrs. Rutledge, though. In your last primary report, over 78% of contributions came from businesses, PACs, or out-of-state donors. Your campaign has also benefited from out-of-state PACs buying television ads. How do you argue your fairness to Arkansans?
My fairness to Arkansans is I've lived in Arkansas practically my entire life. My entire career has been spent here, again, representing Arkansans, Arkansas businesses, advising them about Arkansas law on matters dealing with Arkansas law. I've spent my entire career here. My campaign contributors have recognized my experience. They've recognized my conservatism. They've recognized that I do represent conservative values, which are Arkansas values, and they've contributed to my campaign. I've raised literally tens of thousands of dollars, from Arkansas businesses, from Arkansans, and conservative groups that really trust me to be the conservative candidate for Arkansas Attorney General.
I've been speaking with David Sterling and Leslie Rutledge, who are seeking the GOP nomination for Attorney General in the June 10th runoff. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
For KUAR News, I'm Jacob Kauffman.